Now the author rahimahullah is going to go on to talk about the obligatory acts of tayammum, and then the sunnah acts of tayammum, and so on and so forth. First of all, the first obligatory act of tayammum is an-niyyatu. And here it's important to know that in tayammum, the intention that you're supposed to have is to make what was prohibited permissible, contrary to having the intention of removing the state of purity. You cannot have the intention of removing the state of purity in tayammum, because according to the mashhur opinion, according to the famous opinion of the Maliki School, tayammum does not remove the state of non-wudu, but rather what it does is it permits a person to pray, but it doesn't remove the state. All it's doing is giving a permission for a person to pray, because under the necessity they can't find water. So when a person prays with tayammum, we still say that the person's impurity is still present, or the state of non-purity is still present, but a person when they make tayammum is granted permission to perform a certain act of worship that under normal circumstances a person would have been prohibited from. So make sure you take down that note, that the intention is to make permissible what a person was prohibited from doing. So for example, if a person's making tayammum for prayer, they have the intention to make prayer permissible. I'm making tayammum in order for prayer to be permissible, not in order to remove a state. Secondly, after that, we have as-sa'id. As-sa'id generally refers to the things that are permissible to be used while making tayammum, and we'll get back to that, because after mentioning the fara'id, Akhdari is going to mention what is considered sa'id according to the Maliki method. So sa'id generally refers to those things that are allowed to be used to wipe over when making tayammum. Then he says, and one of the conditions of a sa'id, he says, was sa'id al-tahir, that it has to be pure. It cannot be an impurity. You cannot wipe over an impurity during tayammum. Then he says, وَمَسْحُ الْوَجْهِ, wiping over the face is obligatory. وَمَسْحُ الْيَدَيْنِ إِلَى الْكُوعَيْنِ, wiping during tayammum, it's only obligatory to wipe your hands up to your wrist bones, not all of your arm. All of your arm we're going to mention later on that it's sunnah, but in tayammum to wipe over your hands is enough. So we have two things: wiping over the face and wiping over the hands up until the wrist bones. That's why it says ila al-ku'aini. Ku'aini means wrist bones. Then he mentions another one saying with darbatul ard al-ula. So darbatul ard al-ula means placing your hands. The word darb actually means striking, but that's not what they mean when we're talking about fiqh. Darbatul ard al-ula, touching the ground once when you're making tayammum. So for example, you touch the ground in order to make tayammum with the dirt, that's obligatory. The reason why we call it the first striking is because the reason why we call it the first touching the ground is because the second touching of the ground is only sunnah. So that's what he means by darbatul ard al-ula, placing the hands on the ground once in order to get dust on your hands, in order dust or dirt or soil on your hands in order to make tayammum. Then he says wal fawr. Wal fawr means that it's done continually, and as we mentioned in tayammum, as we mentioned in ghusl, and as we mentioned in wudu. Then a person is going to say, maybe the person will ask the question, well, how are we going to determine the time for continuity when we're making dry ablution? Our limbs are not wet. Here we're going to go back to the estimated time. So the estimated time under normal circumstances that a limb would still remain wet after washing it, then that's what we mean by fawr huna fawr here in tayammum. We're going to look at the estimated time of how long it takes for a limb to dry under normal circumstances. And so, for example, if a person were to make tayammum, for example, he was to strike the earth and then wipe his face, but he didn't finish wiping his hands, and so he sat down and he started to do something else. Then he's going to go. Then he wants to go back and finish his tayammum. Then he's going to ask himself, the time that I waited between completing my tayammum, if I were to make ablution, would my limbs have been dry by now or no? If they would have been dry, then he has to start all over. If he were to consider them to still be wet, then he could complete his ablution by just wiping over his hands and not starting all over again. After that, we have dukhul al-waqt. Know that another obligatory act, another obligation in wudu is that the prayer time has to have entered in order to perform that tayammum. If obviously that tayammum is a fard. For example, if a person wants to make tayammum for Asr prayer, he cannot make it before Asr time comes in. He has to make it after Asr time comes in. And also, if a person were to make tayammum for Dhuhr, as soon as Dhuhr time goes out, that tayammum becomes nullified. So the entering of another prayer time nullifies the present tayammum, and tayammum cannot be made until the prayer time actually exists. So that's why it says وَدُخُولُ الْوَقْتِ, the entering of the time. Another condition is وَاتِّصَالُهُ بِالصَّلَاةِ. Another condition for tayammum is that your tayammum has to be connected to your prayer. What do we mean by connected to your prayer? That after you make your tayammum, that you stand up and you pray and that you don't delay. So for example, if a long time occurs between your tayammum and then you stand up to pray, then it's not valid. For example, you make tayammum and you eat a light breakfast or you eat a light snack and then you want to stand up and pray, then we say no, you have to make tayammum again, because one of the obligatory acts of tayammum is that a person has to, is that it has to be connected to the prayer or whatever act it is that he's performing with the tayammum. So here, Al-Akhdari, if you were to count them up, mentions 8 things that are obligatory for a person during ablution. For the sake of the soundness of tayammum, 8 things are obligatory. Then he goes on and he says, was-sa'id. Afwan, the 8th one that we're just about to mention now is a sa'id. That's the 8th one. A sa'id, as we mentioned before, are those things that a person is permitted to use for tayammum. So he says, was-sa'id huwa turab. Yani sa'id, the first thing that sa'id is sand. And that's the origin of tayammum. So the origin of tayammum is that a person uses sand. So sand is the most preferable thing to use during when a person makes tayammum. And then he mentions after that with tube. Tube means baked brick, yani sun-dried brick. Not baked brick, better to say sun-dried brick, because if it's baked by fire, then it takes another rule. So when we say tube, sun-dried brick. So for example, in places like Yemen, where they still build houses out of sun-dried brick, as long as that sun-dried brick is not mixed with any, it hasn't been burned by fire, it's just naturally baked by the sun, then it's permissible for a person to make tayammum over it, because it's like part of the earth. The only difference is that we took it and we stuck it, we put water on it and we stuck it together and we let it dry. So it's permissible for a person to make tayammum over it. And then after that he mentions wal hajaru. Al hajaru is stones. So stones are permissible to make tayammum over as long as that stone is original. Not, for example, a brick stone that was put together by cement and so on and so forth. We're talking about a natural stone. A person can make tayammum over it. According to the Maliki method as well, he mentions wathalju. Wathalju, ice block. An ice block, it's permissible for a person to make tayammum over it, and according to our scholars, as they mentioned in the books, that an ice block is similar to a rock because of the fact that it's actually a body, and so they permitted that wiping over an ice block is actually sufficient for ablution. For the sake of tayammum. After that, he mentions wal khadkhad. Khadkhad, in Arabic they call it tin al aswad. What we mean by khadkhad is mud. And the reason why we call it tin al aswad, meaning black mud, is because when water hits the surface of dirt and then the water sinks into the ground and the mud is drying out, then the color of the mud is like a black, dark brown color. So we call that khadkhad, and it's permissible for a person to make tayammum from it. And then he says, وَنَحْوُ ذَلِكَ, and things like that. So in general, anything that comes from the ground, from the things that Al-Akhdari mentions here, then it's permissible for him to make tayammum. For example, he didn't mention soil. Soil is just like dirt, and so it is permissible for a person to make tayammum for using soil. And then Al-Akhdari goes on to mention وَلَا يَجُوزُ بِالْجِسِّ الْمَطْبُوخ. Now he's going to go on to mention the things that are not permissible for a person to use during tayammum. And the first thing that he mentions is called jis al-matbukh. Al-jis, according to the books, they mention is plaster. So plaster, like for example, the plaster that they use plaster to make paint, but it has an original substance, and so whatever that original substance is, whatever that original substance is what Al-Akhdari is referring to. I haven't seen it myself, but plaster obviously has some type of origin, and that's what Al-Akhdari is mentioning here. وَلَا يَجُوزُ بِالْجِسِّ الْمَطْبُوخ. Yani, matbukh here means cooked. Anything that is cooked or baked by fire is considered matbukh. So under all circumstances, anything that has changed through being cooked, through fire, or so on and so forth, it's not permissible for a person to use in tayammum. Although he only mentions it in jis here, it applies to all things. So for example, the reason why we said sun-baked brick, because if we were to take those brick and burn them with fire, then we say that that thing is no longer in its original state because it was baked by fire. And then he says wal hasir. Al hasir, we can say means carpet, but it actually means carpet that is woven from leaves. A carpet like Chinese carpets, some of them are weaved together with leaves. That's what we mean by al hasir, or straw, for example. It's not permissible for us to use those for tayammum. As well, he mentions wal khashab. Al khashab, wood, even if that tree is still in the ground, it's not permissible according to the mashhur opinion to use wood, to wipe over wood or a tree trunk for tayammum. And then he says wa nahwihi, and things like it, because in other more advanced books they'll get into detail, but generally what Al-Akhdari here mentions is sufficient sufficient in terms of what can be used and what cannot be used. Then Al-Akhdari is going to mention an issue of fiqh which deals with a dispensation. As we mentioned before, using sand is the most preferable thing to be used during tayammum. Sand is the most preferable thing to use during tayammum. And so from the viewpoint of what is preferable, meaning a fadila or a mustahab, it's mustahab, it's a fadila, it's virtuous for a person to use sand if they can find it. So for example, if you have sand and you have soil, it's preferable for you to make to wipe over to use sand to make tayammum. Or for example, if you have sand and you have sun-dried brick, for example, your house is made out of sun-dried brick, we say that it's preferable for a person to use sand, even if it means he has to go outside in order to get sand, although the walls of his house are made out of sun-dried brick. Here he says, وَرُخِّصَ لِلْمُرِيدِ فِي الْحَائِطِ الْحَجْرِ وَالتُّوبِ إِنْ لَمْ يَجِدْ مُنَاوِلًا غَيْرَهُ. Here a dispensation. This dispensation is related to the request to use turab before anything else. For example, a person is sick. Here this dispensation that we're talking about is going to be is for the sake of a sick person. A sick person now lives in a house of sun-dried bricks. Or a house that's made out of stone. And but he's sick, and he has to make tayammum. According to the original rule, we said that making tayammum with sand is preferable. So a person is requested to, not obligatory, but requested according to from the viewpoint of the fact that it's virtuous to look for sand. But a dispensation is given for the person who is sick to make tayammum on either a stone wall or a sun dried brick wall. It's a dispensation is given for him to use that instead of turab. What do we mean by dispensation? We're not going to say that using turab, that using sand is more preferable for him. We're going to say that anything that you can find is preferable. Contrary to a person who's traveling or a person who's a resident, if they're going to make tayammum, we say that it's preferable for you under all circumstances to use sand more than anything else. But in terms of the person who's sick, we're going to say that it's dropped. The request to seek what is preferable is dropped, and anything that he can find is considered preferable. But that is under the condition that he cannot find somebody to bring him something else. And what do we mean by something else here? To bring him something like turab, like sand. So for example, the person's sick, his house is made out of a substance in which it's permissible for him to make tayammum on. Then we're going to say that we're not going to request him to look for sand, but that's under the condition that he can't find anybody to bring him sand. For example, his son is in his house. He can tell his son, go outside and bring me a plate of sand so that I can make tayammum. Right? So that dispensation is given if he doesn't have the ability to remove the state. But it should be known that under all circumstances, he's free to make tayammum over whatever is permissible to make tayammum, and he doesn't make a sin. He doesn't take a sin for not wiping over sand, but he left what was preferable for him, which means to request seeking out sand before using anything else.